I went into the North Cascades alone, expecting nothing more than solitude and clear thinking. But Bigfoot terrorized me for hours outside my tent, and I have proof. On my second night, miles from civilization, the forest went dead silent instantly, like a switch had been flipped. Then came the knocks. Deep, wood-on-wood sounds from the ridgeline answered from down the valley. At first light, I found a massive track, 16 inches long, 5 toes, pressed impossibly deep into the mud. I kept moving until I found 3 trees snapped at chest height and stacked deliberately against a boulder. That night, something circled my camp for hours, measured footfalls, a guttural huff, a stench that froze me in place. I recorded everything, lying motionless, certain I was being studied. When I showed rangers my evidence, they dismissed it as bears and isolation. But I have the recordings. What was evaluating me in that darkness? Why did it let me go? And why won't anyone admit what happened? I'm not the kind of person who scares easily in the woods. I want to make that clear right up front, because when I'm about to tell you what happened to me in October of last year, it still doesn't make sense. And I've tried. I've spent months trying to rationalize it, trying to fit it into something I can understand. My name is Derek Hollis. I'm 38, work as a GIS analyst in Bellingham, Washington. I spend my days staring at satellite imagery and topographic maps, analyzing terrain data for environmental surveys. It's precise work. Everything has an explanation, a measurable reason. Maybe that's why I've always felt more comfortable in the wilderness than I do in town. Out there, things make sense. Cause and effect. Weather patterns, animal behavior, no ambiguity. I've been divorced for 2 years now. That's relevant, I guess, because it's why I started doing more solo trips. My ex-wife used to say I loved the mountains more than I loved people. She wasn't entirely wrong. After the divorce was finalized, I stopped pretending I needed anyone else on the trail with me. Most people find loneliness in isolation. I find clarity. I've logged hundreds of nights in the backcountry. I know what I'm doing out there. I carry a 10-pound pack ultralight setup, everything measured and tested. I don't bring a satellite beacon or a spot device. I know that makes some people uncomfortable, but I've always considered those things crutches. If you know how to read a map, if you understand terrain and weather, you don't need an emergency button. The trip I'm telling you about started on October 12th. I'd filed for a permit to hike a drainage basin west of Ross Lake in the North Cascades. It's remote country, not many people go there, because the maintained trails peter out after a few miles. You're mostly bushwhacking, following game trails and creek beds. That's exactly why I picked it. I left Bellingham before dawn, drove the 2 hours to the trailhead on a gravel spur road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The Forest Service gate was open, but the parking area was empty. Just me and the alders crowding the edges. I shouldered my pack, checked my compass bearing, and started walking as the sun came up behind the ridge. The first 6 miles were perfect. Old-growth Douglas fir, some of them 8 feet across at the base. Sword ferns thick enough you had to push through them where they crossed the trail. The air smelled like October wet moss, cedar, that particular cold clarity you only get in the mountains when the season's turning. I heard chipmunks chattering in the understory, saw a raven circling high above the canopy. Normal sounds. Comfortable sounds. I made good time, stopping only to filter water from a side creek around mile 4. My topo map showed the drainage opening up ahead, transitioning from dense forest to more scattered stands with talus slopes between them. The trail was barely visible in quote. Places just a suggestion of packed earth and broken branches where deer had passed through. By mid-afternoon, my legs had that good burn that comes from steady elevation gain. I climbed maybe 1,500 feet from the trailhead. The forest felt exactly how it should feel. Alive, indifferent, ancient. I wasn't thinking about anything except where to set up camp and whether I'd have enough daylight to hang my food properly. Looking back now, I remember thinking how ordinary it all was. How completely, perfectly normal. I didn't know yet that I was already being watched. I reached my planned campsite around 3 in the afternoon. It was exactly where I'd marked it on my map, a flat clearing beside a nameless creek at 3,800 feet, ringed by western hemlock. The ground was soft with decades of needles, and there was a natural depression near the creek where I could filter water without trampling the bank too much. Leave no trace principles. I've always been careful about that. Setting up my tarp and bivvy took maybe 15 minutes. I've done it hundreds of times and I've got the routine down. Find 2 trees about 12 feet apart, string the ridgeline, stake out the corners, lay the bivvy underneath. It's not a tent, just a waterproof sack I slide my sleeping quilt into. Some people think that's too minimal, too exposed, but I like being able to hear the forest. I like knowing what's around me. I pumped water through my Sawyer filter, ate a cold dinner, just a tortilla with peanut butter and some dried apricots, and sat on a log watching the light change. That's one of my favorite parts of solo camping. No conversation. No need to entertain anyone or explain why, I'm just sitting there. The forest does its thing, you do yours. As dusk settled in, the usual evening symphony started up. Frogs down by the creek, their calls overlapping in that rhythmic chorus they do. A barred owl somewhere upslope, doing its "who cooks for you" call. Wind moving through the canopy high above, making the hemlocks sway. I pulled out my Write in the Rain journal and wrote a few lines by headlamp. Nothing profound, just notes about mileage, elevation, the satisfaction of a good day's hike. I was asleep by 9 o'clock, maybe earlier. Just slid into my bivvy, pulled the quilt up to my chin, and let the sound of the creek pull me under. I woke up sometime around midnight, needing to pee. That's normal. I always drink a lot of water before bed to stay hydrated. I unzipped the bivvy, pulled on my boots without lacing them, and stepped out into the clearing. It was cold enough that I could see my breath. Clear sky, stars thick overhead between the trees. That's when I noticed the silence. Not gradual. Not the slow quieting you get when it's late and animals settle down for the night. This was different. It was like someone had flipped a switch. The frogs had stopped. The wind had stopped. I couldn't hear a single thing except the creek, and even that seemed muted, like the sound was being absorbed by something. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, listening. My rational brain was already working on explanations. Barometric pressure change. Maybe a predator nearby, a cougar or bear that had spooked everything into silence. That happens sometimes. Animals go quiet when something dangerous is moving through. But I didn't smell anything. Didn't hear anything. Just that heavy, waiting silence. I finished urinating, went back to my bivvy, and zipped myself in. Told myself it was nothing. Weather shifting. Probably going to rain tomorrow. I pulled the quilt tighter and closed my eyes. Eventually I drifted off again, though I don't think I slept deeply. Some part of my brain was still listening, still waiting for the forest to start talking again. It didn't. I woke sharply at 2:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my phone, thinking maybe I'd only been asleep for a few minutes. But no, it had been over. 2 hours since I'd noticed the silence. The sound that woke me was a knock. Not a branch falling, not a tree cracking in the cold. A knock. Wood on wood, deep and resonant, like someone had taken a baseball bat and struck it against a hollow log. It came from upslope, maybe 300 yards above my camp, somewhere on the ridge. I lay completely still in my bivvy, heart hammering against my ribs. My rational brain was already working. Deadfall, thermal contraction, maybe a tree that had been weakened by beetles finally giving way. The mountains make sounds at night, I know that. I've heard plenty of strange noises over the years. Then, 30 seconds later, a second knock answered from down valley. Different direction, distinctly different. Same deliberate, resonant tone. My mouth went dry. I unzipped my bivvy as quietly as I could and sat up, straining to hear anything else. The forest was still silent, that same heavy, waiting silence from earlier. No wind. No frogs. Nothing. Just my own breathing and the muted sound of the creek. I stayed like that for 20 minutes, maybe longer, listening, waiting for a third knock, or movement, or something that would give me an explanation I could accept. But nothing came. The silence just sat there, thick and expectant, like the forest was holding its breath. Eventually, my legs started cramping from sitting in one position. The cold was seeping through my quilt, and I realized I was shivering not from fear, I told myself, just from the temperature. It had to be in the low 40s, maybe upper 30s. I told myself it was nothing. Trees fall in the forest all the time. The fact that two fell within 30 seconds of each other was just coincidence. Bad luck. The kind of thing that seems strange in the moment but makes perfect sense in daylight. I lay back down and pulled the quilt up to my chin. My knife was right there beside me, a folding buck with a 3-inch blade. I'd never felt I need to keep it close before, but now my hand rested on it. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to drift off, some part of my brain would jerk me back awake, convinced I'd heard something, but there was nothing to hear, just silence. Exhaustion finally won out, around 4 in the morning. I fell into a fitful sleep, the kind where you're half aware of where you are, your body tense and ready to wake at the slightest sound. When dawn finally came, gray and cold, I'd never been so glad to see morning light. First light in the mountains is gradual. It doesn't announce itself, it just slowly bleeds into the darkness until you realize you can see the trees around you, then the details of bark and needle and stone. I lay in my bivvy, watching that transition, listening to the forest wake up. The frogs started again, a few birds calling from the canopy, the normal sounds returning like someone had given permission. I unzipped my bivvy and stepped out into the clearing. My boots were damp with dew. The air was sharp and clean, smelling of hemlock and creek water. Everything looked exactly how it had when I'd set up camp the previous afternoon. Normal, peaceful. I tried to shake off the unease from the night, told myself I'd let my imagination run away with me. 2 trees falling in the night. That's all it was. But I needed to check. I needed to walk the perimeter of my camp, look for tracks, find some kind of evidence that would confirm what I already knew. Nothing had been there. I was alone. I'd always been alone. I started at the creek, following the bank upstream toward the spring where I'd filtered water yesterday. The ground was soft there, a mix of mud and moss, perfect for holding impressions. I'd seen deer tracks when I'd filled my bottles, and the small paw prints of what might have been a marten. That's where I found it. A single track, pressed into the mud about 6 feet from the spring. 16 inches long, I measured it later, with my trekking pole. 5 toes, splayed and distinct, a pronounced arch in the middle, almost human in structure but massive. The depth was what got me. The edges were clean and sharp, pressed so deep into the soft ground that whatever made it had to weigh 800 pounds, maybe more. I stood there staring at it for I don't know how long. My stomach had that tight, cold feeling you get when something doesn't make sense, when your brain is trying to force reality into a shape it refuses to take. This was no bear. I've seen bear tracks, hundreds of them. They're plantigrade like this, sure, but the proportions are wrong, the claw marks are wrong. Everything about this was wrong. It wasn't elk. It wasn't deer. It wasn't human, not unless someone was walking around these mountains on stilts in the middle of the night. I pulled out my phone and took photos from multiple angles, my hands shaking enough that I had to brace my elbows against my knees to keep the images steady. I used my trekking pole for scale, laying it alongside the print. Then I took more photos of the surrounding area, documenting the location, the terrain, the spring itself. My brain was working through possibilities. Hoax? But who would be up here? I hadn't seen another person since I'd left the trailhead. The permit system showed no one else had filed for this drainage in the past week. And why? For what purpose? Distortion? Maybe an old track that rain had warped into something strange? But the edges were too clean, too fresh, and we hadn't had rain in 3 days. I considered hiking out right then, packing up and leaving, getting back to my truck and pretending this hadn't happened. But that felt like overreacting. I'd come here for 4 days. I had food, water, gear. One strange track didn't mean I was in danger. Animals avoid people. Whatever made this print, and I wasn't ready to think about what that might be, it clearly hadn't approached my camp. It had stayed by the spring, maybe 30 yards away. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally. The track could be old. Could have been there before I arrived, and I just hadn't noticed it yesterday. The lighting was different now, the angle of the sun. That made sense. I broke camp methodically, packing my tarp and bivvy, stowing my gear. My hands were steadier now. I was making a decision. I'd continue up valley toward my planned second camp. If I saw anything else strange, I'd reassess. But I wasn't going to let one unexplained track ruin my trip. I shouldered my pack and started hiking. The trail, such as it was, continued up the drainage, gaining elevation through thinning forest. I kept my pace steady, but I was listening now, really listening. Every sound registered: the crunch of my boots on pine needles, the rustle of something small moving through the undergrowth, the distant call of a Clark's nutcracker. I was hyper-alert. Every part of me was paying attention. And I kept thinking about that track. About how deep it had been pressed into the mud. About the 5 toes and the arch and the impossible size of it. About the knocks I'd heard in the darkness, answering each other from different directions. I hiked 4 miles deeper into the drainage that morning, gaining another 400 feet in elevation. The forest was changing as I climbed fewer hemlocks, more lodgepole pine and scattered subalpine fir. The canopy opened up in places where talus slopes broke through, gray stone rubble from ancient rock slides. My legs felt strong. The rhythm of hiking helped quiet my mind. With every step away from that track by the creek, it became easier to rationalize, easier to push into the category of strange but explainable. I'd seen weird things in the woods before. Nature does unexpected things. Around midday, I had to cut cross-country to avoid a washout where the creek had jumped its banks during spring runoff, carving a steep-sided gully through what used to be trail. My topo map showed the drainage continuing northwest, so I picked my way through the forest, using my compass to maintain bearing. That's when I found the structure. I almost walked past it. It was maybe 20 yards off my route, partially hidden behind a boulder the size of a pickup truck. But something about the angles caught my eye. Straight lines where there shouldn't be straight lines. 3 lodgepole pines, each 8 to 10 inches in diameter, snapped at roughly chest height and stacked against the boulder in a triangular lean. Like a teepee frame, but crude. Deliberate. I stopped walking, just stood there staring at it. The breaks were green, fresh. I could see the pale wood exposed where the trunks had been snapped, still sticky with sap. These trees hadn't fallen, they'd been broken. And not by wind. You don't get clean breaks like that from windfall. The wood splinters, tears, leaves, ragged edges. These were snapped, bent until they gave way. I approached slowly, my pack suddenly feeling heavy on my shoulders. The trees had been dragged. I could see the marks in the pine needles where they'd been pulled across the ground. They'd been positioned carefully, the broken ends wedged together at the top, the bases spread wide. I walked around the structure, touched one of the trunks. The bark was rough under my palm, the wood solid. Each tree had to weigh a couple 100 pounds, minimum. Moving them would take significant strength. Breaking them would take more. That's when I smelled it. Faint but distinct, a musk in the air. Animal, but not like anything I recognized. Not bear, not cougar, not elk. Something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I pulled out my phone and took photos from multiple angles. Wide shots showing the whole structure, close-ups of the breaks, the boulder, the surrounding terrain. Then I opened my GPS app and marked the coordinates. 48, 7,392 degrees, N. 121, 2,847 degrees W. Elevation 4,180 feet. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I was documenting evidence, approaching this like the analyst I was, gathering data, but underneath that professional calm, something primitive in my brain was screaming at me to leave. No human had made this. The location was too remote. I was at least 5 miles from the nearest maintained trail, probably 7 or 8 miles from the nearest road. And why would someone hike all the way out here just to snap 3 trees and stack them against a rock? Weather couldn't do this. Not with this precision, not with this configuration, which left what? I didn't want to think about it. Didn't want to follow that line of reasoning to its conclusion, because the conclusion was impossible. It violated everything I knew about wildlife in the Pacific Northwest, everything I'd learned in my hundreds of nights camping. But the evidence was right in front of me. The broken trees, the musk in the air, the track from this morning. 16 inches long, with 5 splayed toes. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just looking at the structure, trying to find another explanation. Failing. Finally, I turned and continued hiking. I didn't run, didn't panic, just kept moving up valley toward my planned campsite, maintaining my pace, breathing steady. But I was listening now. Really listening. Every sound registered with crystal clarity, the scrape of my boots on stone, the rustle of wind through pine boughs, the distant call of a jay. and I kept glancing back over my shoulder, scanning the tree line, looking for movement in the shadows. Because I was starting to understand something I didn't want to understand. I wasn't alone in this drainage. I'd never been alone. Something else lived here, something that didn't want to be seen. By late afternoon, I reached my second planned campsite at 4,200 feet. It was a small bench above a willow marsh, with a clear view down the valley I'd just climbed. The location felt more exposed than the previous night's camp. Fewer trees, more open space, but it was the flattest ground for miles, and I was tired. I set up my tarp and bivvy, quickly, efficient movements born from practice, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept thinking about the structure, about what kind of strength it would take to snap 3 trees and stack them like that. 800 pounds. Maybe more. I pumped water from a small seep, boiled it on my MSR stove for dinner, just ramen with some jerky torn into it. The familiar routine helped settle my nerves. This was what I did. This was normal. After eating, I sat on my pack and pulled out my phone, reviewing the photos I'd taken. The track from this morning, the structure from midday. I zoomed in on details, looking for anything I might have missed. The track was clear, undeniable. 5 toes, pronounced arch, depth that suggested massive weight. The structure showed no tool marks, no saw cuts, just raw breaks where the wood had given way under pressure. I tried to think of explanations. Really tried. But everything I came up with fell apart under scrutiny. This wasn't a hoax. This wasn't weather. This wasn't any animal I could name. The sun was setting behind the western ridge, shadows lengthening across the valley. The temperature was dropping fast, probably down to the mid-30s already. I pulled on my down jacket and watched the light fade. That's when I heard the first knock. Same sound as last night. Wood on wood, deep and resonant. But closer now, much closer. Maybe 200 yards upslope, somewhere in the scattered pines above my camp. I went completely still, barely breathing. 30 seconds later, another knock answered. This one from across the marsh, to the east. Then a third, back up slope, but from a different location than the first. They were communicating. That's what it sounded like. 3 distinct positions, signaling to each other. And I was in the middle. My hand started trembling. I fumbled for my phone, opened the voice recorder app, and hit record. The knocks had stopped, but I kept recording anyway, holding the phone out in front of me like it could protect me somehow. The twilight deepened. Stars began appearing overhead, and the forest went quiet again, that same heavy, waiting silence from the previous night. I retreated to my bivvy and slid inside, still wearing my down jacket. I zipped it up to my chest, leaving my arms free. My knife was in my right hand. The phone, still recording, was in my left. I didn't take off my boots, didn't loosen my pack. I just lay there in the gathering darkness, listening, and I thought about that structure, about the deliberate way those trees had been positioned, about the track pressed deep into the mud by something that weighed as much as a grizzly but walked on 2 feet, about the knocks, coordinating from multiple directions, boxing me in. The forest. I felt different now, not peaceful, not indifferent. It felt alive with intention, with intelligence. Whatever was out there, it knew I was here. It had known since I'd entered this drainage. And now, on my second night, it wasn't hiding anymore. It was announcing itself. Night fell completely, and the knocking stopped. What replaced it was worse, that heavy, suffocating silence. The kind that makes you aware of every breath you take, every small movement of fabric against fabric. I lay in my bivvy, with my phone still recording. The screen dimmed to conserve battery. The timestamp showed 9:47 p.m. I'd been lying here for over an hour, rigid and listening, waiting for something to happen. At 10:04 p.m., I heard movement. Footfalls, slow and measured. The crunch of boots on gravel, except I knew it wasn't boots. The sound was coming from maybe 50 yards away, somewhere near the edge of the willow marsh. Step. Pause. Step. Pause. The rhythm was deliberate, unhurried. Bipedal. I held my breath, straining to track the direction. The footfalls were moving, not toward me, but around me, circling. My rational brain tried one last time to assert itself. Bear. It has to be a bear. They can walk on two legs for short distances, especially when investigating something. But the cadence was wrong. Bears lumber. They're heavy and clumsy on 2 feet. This was measured, controlled. The gait of something that walked upright naturally. Step, pause, step, pause. It was moving clockwise around my camp, maintaining that 50-yard distance. I could track it by sound alone as it passed behind me, north of my position, then around to the east. It took maybe 5 minutes to complete the circuit, then it stopped. Complete silence for perhaps 30 seconds. Then a sound that made my skin crawl, a guttural huff. Low and resonant, like air being forced through a large chest cavity, almost questioning in tone. It came from the darkness near the willows, due east of where I lay. And then the smell hit me. It came with the breeze, drifting through the mesh of my bivvy. Wet fur and decay, but stronger than that. Organic, primal. The smell of something alive and massive and wild. Not the musk of a bear, not the sharp tang of a cougar. This was different, older somehow. My eyes were wide in the darkness, though I couldn't see anything beyond the faint starlight filtering through the tarp above me. My right hand gripped my knife so hard my fingers ached. My left hand held the phone against my chest, still recording. The footfalls started again, closer now, maybe 30 yards. Still circling but tightening the radius. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. To grab my pack and bolt down the valley, to put distance between myself and whatever was out there. But another part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive on dozens of solo trips, knew that running in the dark would be worse. I'd fall, break an ankle, become vulnerable. Whatever was circling me could move through this terrain far better than I could, so I stayed frozen, trying to breathe quietly, trying not to show fear, though I don't know if that mattered. It could probably smell the fear on me. The circling continued. Around and around. Sometimes stopping for long stretches where I heard nothing except my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then starting again. The pattern felt intentional, methodical, like it was studying me, learning my responses. At one point, maybe around 11:30, I heard a sharp crack, a branch being snapped, then another, and another. Rhythmic, deliberate. The sounds were spaced evenly, maybe 10 seconds apart. Not the random breaking of deadfall. This was controlled, purposeful. It was breaking branches to announce its presence, to let me know it was still there, still watching. I played back some of the recording through my earbuds, volume barely above a whisper. The footfalls were clear, unmistakable, bipedal. The huff was there too, that low questioning rumble, and the snaps, sharp cracks that came in steady intervals. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't fear playing tricks. This was real, documented, undeniable. Something was circling my camp, something large and intelligent and patient, and I had no idea what it wanted. The temperature continued dropping. I could see my breath now, even in the darkness. My down jacket wasn't enough. I was shivering from cold or fear or both. I couldn't tell anymore. The hours crawled by. The circling continued intermittently, sometimes close, sometimes distant. Always there, always present. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I just lay there in my bivvy, every muscle tense, waiting for dawn. The circling stopped around 1:30 a.m., just went completely silent, like whatever had been out there had simply vanished. But I knew better than to relax. The silence felt tactical, patient. I kept my phone recording. The battery was down to 43%, but I didn't care. This was evidence. This was proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Around 2 a.m., the activity intensified. The footfalls returned, but closer now, maybe 20 yards from my tarp. I could hear individual stones being displaced, the crunch of dry grass being compressed under weight. It wasn't circling anymore. It was approaching. Then it stopped, directly north of my position. I could feel it there, a presence in the darkness, watching. I lay absolutely still. My knife was gripped in my right hand, the blade open against my thigh. Not that it would do any good against something that could snap 8-inch trees like kindling, but it was all I had. The silence stretched out. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. Then I heard breathing, deep, slow, The sound of large lungs expanding and contracting. It was maybe 15 yards away now. Close enough that I should be able to see it, except there was no moon and the starlight was too dim. Just darkness and that rhythmic breathing. Another huff. Louder this time. More forceful. I wanted to call out. To yell, "Get back," or make noise, to scare it away. But my throat was closed tight, my voice locked somewhere deep in my chest, and part of me knew that making noise would be a mistake. That would change the dynamic from observation to confrontation. So, I stayed silent, barely breathing, waiting. The presence remained for what felt like an eternity. I could sense its size, the way it displaced space, the weight of its attention. This wasn't a curious animal investigating a camp. This was something else. Something evaluating, deciding. Then, without warning, a low rumble started. Not a growl exactly. More like a vibration that I felt through the ground before I heard it. Deep bass frequencies that resonated in my chest cavity. It built slowly, sustained for maybe 10 seconds, then faded. The sound was communication. I knew it instinctively. It was saying something to me, or to others of its kind. I had no idea what the message was, but the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't aggression. It was acknowledgement, recognition, like it was confirming I was there, cataloging me. The footfalls retreated, slow steps moving back toward the north, away from my camp. I tracked them by sound until they faded into the distance, somewhere up the slope in the scattered pines. Then silence again, complete and absolute. I lay there shaking, adrenaline flooding my system. My hands were cramping from gripping the knife so hard. I forced myself to relax my fingers, to breathe deeply, to think clearly. I'd just been evaluated, studied. Whatever had circled my camp for hours had approached within 15 yards, observed me, communicated something, and then withdrawn. It had chosen not to harm me. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't, because the intelligence behind that choice was what terrified me. This wasn't a bear defending territory or a cougar stalking prey. This was something making calculated decisions. Something that understood I was there, understood I was vulnerable, and chose a specific course of action. I pulled out my earbuds and played back the last few minutes of audio. The footfalls were clear. The breathing was there, deep, rhythmic, unmistakable. And that rumble, that low-frequency vibration, came through as a sustained tone that made my phone's speaker distort. Evidence. Undeniable evidence. The rest of the night passed in a state of heightened alertness. I heard occasional sounds in the distance, branches snapping, what might have been vocalizations too far away to identify clearly. But nothing approached my camp again. At some point, exhaustion must have pulled me under for brief moments, because I'd jerk awake, thinking I'd heard something, only to find the forest still silent. My phone timestamp would show only minutes had passed. Microsleeps born from pure mental and physical exhaustion. But mostly I stayed awake, watching the stars wheel overhead through gaps in my tarp, listening to every sound, trying to process what had just happened. The first gray light of dawn started seeping into the eastern sky around 5:30 a.m. I'd never been so grateful to see morning coming. As the light grew stronger, I could finally see my surroundings. The willow marsh spreading out below my camp, the scattered pines on the slopes above. Everything looked normal, peaceful, like nothing had happened. But something had happened. I had the audio. I had the memory of that breathing, that rumble, that presence 15 yards away in the darkness. I knew what I had to do. I had to get out of this drainage. Had to leave, right now. Whatever was here, whatever had claimed this territory, I wasn't welcome. I'd been studied, evaluated, and now I needed to leave before it decided I was something other than a curious intruder. I started breaking camp without bothering to heat water for coffee. My hands were shaking, but functional. Everything got stuffed into my pack with none of my usual care for organization. I was leaving, and I wasn't coming back. I was packed and moving by 6:15 a.m. The sun wasn't up yet, but there was enough gray light to navigate by. I didn't follow my planned route, didn't even consider it. I pulled out my compass and took a bearing due west. toward where I knew a maintained trail ran parallel to the drainage about 4 miles away. 4 miles of bushwhacking through dense forest and talus slopes. Normally I'd avoid that kind of cross-country travel, too much risk of getting turned around, too easy to twist an ankle. But staying in this drainage felt worse. Much worse. I moved fast, pushing through underbrush, scrambling over deadfall, not caring about the noise I was making. My pack bounced awkwardly on my shoulders because I hadn't taken time to adjust the straps properly. My legs burned from the sustained pace, but I didn't slow. Down, the forest felt different in daylight. Oppressive. The trees seemed closer together than they had been, the shadows deeper. Every snap of a branch under my boots made me flinch. Every bird call made me stop and listen, trying to determine if it was actually a bird or something else. I kept glancing over my shoulder. Couldn't help it. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, that prickling sensation on the back of your neck that tells you you're not alone. But every time I looked, there was nothing. Just trees and ferns and scattered boulders. Empty forest. Except it wasn't empty. I knew that now. By 8 a.m., I'd covered maybe 2 miles. My shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold morning air. I stopped to drink water and check my compass bearing, hands trembling as I held the compass flat. That's when I heard it. A crack. Sharp and distinct. Somewhere behind me and upslope, maybe 200 yards back. I froze, listening. Another crack. Closer. A branch being snapped deliberately. It was following me. I didn't wait to hear more. I shouldered my pack and started moving again, faster now, not caring about maintaining a perfect bearing. West. Just keep going west. Get to the trail. Get out. My mind was racing, replaying the sounds from last night. The circling. The breathing. That low rumble that had vibrated through the ground. Whatever had studied my camp was behind me now, tracking my movement through the forest. The terrain got rougher, a steep ravine cutting across my path that forced me to angle south to find a crossing point. I half slid down the slope, grabbing at saplings to control my descent, then scrambled up the far side. My calves were screaming, my lungs burned. Another crack. Upslope and maybe 100 yards back now. It was pacing me, matching my speed. Not closing the distance, but not falling behind either. Just following. I thought about the audio I'd recorded, the measured footfalls, the intelligence behind them. This wasn't a predator hunting prey. This was something else. Observation, documentation, maybe even curiosity. But knowing that didn't make it less terrifying. By 10:30 a.m., I intersected a rough trail, barely visible, probably a game trail that had been used by hikers enough to leave faint marks. But it was heading northwest, which was close enough to west for me. I turned onto it and increased my pace, nearly jogging now. The sounds behind me had stopped. Or maybe I just couldn't hear them anymore, over my own footfalls and heavy breathing. Around midday, I hit the maintained trail. Actual trail, with switchbacks and cut logs and trail markers. I almost cried with relief. I turned downslope and started the long descent toward the trailhead, my legs burning but my pace relentless. The forest felt normal again here. Birds singing. A squirrel chattering from a branch. The oppressive weight of being watched had lifted, or maybe I was just too far from that drainage now for whatever lived there to follow. I passed a day hiker coming up, a woman in her 50s with trekking poles and a small pack. She smiled and said good morning. I managed to nod but didn't stop. Couldn't stop. I needed to keep moving. The trailhead parking lot came into view around 2 p.m. My truck was exactly where I'd left it 3 days ago, dusty and solid and real. I fumbled with my keys, threw my pack in the bed, and climbed into the cab. For a long moment, I just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, breathing hard. Safe. I was safe. I started the engine and drove straight out, not looking back at the forest. Not thinking about what I was leaving behind, just driving, putting miles between myself and that drainage basin west of Ross Lake. It wasn't until I hit pavement that I finally started to relax. And that's when everything I'd pushed down, all the fear and adrenaline and disbelief, came flooding back. My hands started shaking so badly I had to pull over. I didn't go home. Not right away. I drove to a gas station in Marblemount, used the bathroom, bought a coffee I didn't drink. Sat in my truck in the parking lot trying to figure out what to do next. The rational part of my brain, the analyst, the scientist, knew I should report this, document it, get it on record. I had evidence. Photos of the track and the structure, audio recordings of the footfalls and that rumble and the branch snapping. But another part of me wanted to forget the whole thing. Drive home, delete the files, pretend it never happened. Because admitting it happened meant admitting I didn't understand the world as well as I thought I did. I sat there for 2 days. Not literally, I got a motel room in concrete, ate at a diner, tried to sleep. But mentally I was stuck, unable to move forward or back. On the morning of October 15th, I drove to the North Cascades National Park Ranger Station in Marblemount. The building was small and efficient log construction with a green metal roof, informational displays about wildlife and leave no trace principles. A woman sat behind the counter, maybe mid-40s, wearing the flat hat and uniform of the National Park Service. Her name tag read, Collins. "Help you?" she asked. Professional but warm. The kind of ranger who dealt with everything from lost hikers to bear encounters. "I need to file a report," I said, "about an incident in the backcountry." She pulled out a form and a pen. "Okay, when and where?" I gave her the dates and the drainage location, described my permit. She nodded, typing notes into her computer, all very routine. Then I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos. The track first. 16 inches long, 5 toes, that pronounced arch. Her expression didn't change. She looked at the image, zoomed in slightly, then nodded. "Could be bear. They can leave prints that look humanoid, especially in soft mud." "It's not bear," I said. Kept my voice calm. "I know what bear prints look like." She made a note. Moved to the next photo, the structure. 3 lodgepole pines snapped and stacked against the boulder. "Tree damage," she said. "Consistent with weather patterns or elk activity, they rub bark during rut season, can snap smaller trees." "Those trees are 8 to 10 inches in diameter," I said. "And they were stacked, positioned deliberately." Another note. Still typing, not looking at me. I played the audio recording. The footfalls were clear through my phone's speaker. Bipedal, measured, then the huff, then the branch snaps. Collins listened politely. When it finished, she nodded. Seasonal vocalizations. Could be bear, could be elk. The snapping sounds are consistent with normal forest activity. I felt something tighten in my chest. Frustration, anger. "You're not hearing what I'm telling you." Something circled my camp for hours, something large and bipedal, something that... "Mr. Hollis," she interrupted gently. "We receive dozens of reports like this every year. Unusual sounds, strange tracks, structures that seem out of place. In almost every case, there's a natural explanation. Wildlife behavior, weather patterns, sometimes practical jokes by other hikers. There were no other hikers. I was alone out there." She made more notes. I watched her type. Possible bear activity, large male. Seasonal vocalizations. Tree damage consistent with weather or elk. "I'm not investigating this further," she said, looking up at me finally. "I'm documenting your report, which I'm required to do. But without physical evidence or injury, we don't have resources to send rangers into the field. We're understaffed as it is. I have evidence. I just showed you. You have photos of tracks and trees. That's not conclusive." Her tone was still polite but firm. "Look, isolation does strange things to people. 3 days alone in the backcountry, every sound becomes amplified. Pattern recognition kicks in. It's normal human psychology." I stared at her. "You think I imagined this? I think you experienced something that scared you, and I'm sorry for that. But I can't file a report claiming you encountered what? What exactly are you suggesting was out there?" I didn't answer. Because saying it out loud, actually naming it, would make me sound exactly as irrational as she was implying. She finished typing and printed out a copy of the incident report, handed it to me. "Thank you for reporting this. If you experience any lingering anxiety or sleep disturbances, I'd recommend talking to someone. Traumatic experiences in the wilderness can have lasting effects." I took the paper, read through it quickly. Everything I'd said had been translated into sterile, dismissive language. Hiker reports unusual sounds and tracks. Assessment. Likely wildlife activity, possible disorientation from isolation. Is that it? I asked. That's it. She offered a sympathetic smile. Stay safe out there, Mr. Hollis. I left the ranger station and sat in my truck, staring at the incident report. She hadn't believed me, hadn't even considered the possibility that what I'd experienced was real. But it was real. I had the evidence. I had the audio. And I had the memory of that presence 15 yards away in the darkness, breathing and evaluating and deciding what to do with me. Whether she believed me or not didn't change what had happened in that drainage basin west of Ross Lake. Something lived there. Something that didn't want to be acknowledged, and I'd been allowed to leave. I drove back to Bellingham that afternoon, but I didn't feel like I'd really left. Part of me was still in that drainage, lying in my bivvy, listening to footfalls circle in the darkness. The first thing I did when I got home was plug my phone into my laptop and back up everything. The photos, the audio recordings, all of it copied to 3 different locations, my hard drive, an external backup, and cloud storage. I wasn't going to lose this evidence. Then I started analyzing it. I opened the track photo in Photoshop and enlarged it until I could see individual grains of soil, 16 inches from heel to toe. The toes were distinct, 5 of them, splayed wide like they were bearing weight. There was an arch, a ball of the foot. This wasn't a bear paw that happened to look humanoid. This was a foot, a massive foot that belonged to something bipedal. I pulled up comparison images online. Black bear tracks, grizzly tracks, human footprints for scale. Nothing matched. The proportions were wrong for bear, too narrow, too long, the toe arrangement completely different, and it was far too large for human. I spent 3 hours going down rabbit holes on the internet, searching North Cascades footprints, Sasquatch reports Washington, bipedal primate Pacific Northwest. What I found was a pattern. Dozens of reports, hundreds maybe, going back decades. Knocks in the night, structures made from broken trees, circling behavior, that same sense of being watched, evaluated, studied. Most reports were dismissed or ignored. A few had photos, tracks, structures, blurry images that could be anything. But the consistency was striking. People describing the same sequence of events I'd experienced. The silence, the knocks, the feeling of presence. And almost always, the witnesses were alone. Solo hikers, hunters, loggers working remote areas. I found a website run by someone local, a guy who archived Pacific Northwest encounter reports. The site was basic, clearly homemade, but thorough. He had audio analysis tools, track comparison databases, maps showing clusters of reports. I sent him an email, kept it simple. Had an encounter west of Ross Lake, October 12 to 14. Have audio and photos. Would like your opinion. He responded within 2 hours. Asked me to call him. His name was Vernon, lived in Skagit County. Retired logger, he said, spent 30 years working remote timber sales in the Cascades. He'd heard things, seen things, started collecting reports after his own encounter in 1987, though he didn't go into detail about that. I played him the audio over the phone. The footfalls, the huff, the branch snaps. He listened without interrupting. That's bipedal, he said when it finished. No question, the cadence is wrong for bear, wrong for any quadruped moving on 2 legs. And that huff, I've heard that before. Low-frequency vocalization, probably infrasound component we can't fully hear on recording. So, what was it? You know what it was. His tone wasn't confrontational, just matter of fact. Question is whether you're ready to admit it. I didn't answer right away, because saying it out loud felt like crossing a line, accepting something that violated my entire understanding of the natural world. Sasquatch, Vernon said, filling the silence. Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. There's a breeding population in the North Cascades. Has been for as long as anyone can remember. They're reclusive, intelligent, territorial. What you experience, the knocks, the circling, that's textbook behavior. They were communicating about you, deciding whether you were a threat. Why didn't it attack me? Because you're not food. You're not a threat to their young. You were just passing through their territory and they wanted to make sure you knew it. He paused. They could have hurt you easily. Chose not to. That tells you something about their intelligence. The ranger didn't believe me. Vernon laughed, but there was no humor in it. Of course she didn't. That's policy. They can't acknowledge it officially. Too much liability, too much pressure from skeptics. But off the record, rangers know. Forest Service knows. They just can't say it. He told me I should go back, set up trail cameras, document more evidence, contribute to the understanding of these creatures. I told him no, I wasn't ready. Might never be. That's fair, he said. Not everyone needs to be a researcher. But keep your evidence safe. And if you ever want to talk about it with someone who won't think you're crazy, you know where to find me. We hung up, and I sat there staring at my laptop screen. At the enlarged photo of that 16-inch track pressed deep into the mud, Vernon had confirmed what I already knew, what I'd been afraid to admit. Something lived in that drainage. Something undocumented. Something intelligent and hidden. And I had the proof. The weeks after I got back were harder than the encounter itself. I went to work, sat at my desk analyzing satellite imagery and terrain data, answered emails, attended meetings, did all the normal things. But I wasn't really present. My mind kept drifting back to that night, the circling footfalls, the breathing, that low rumble that had vibrated through the ground. I'd flinch at unexpected sounds. A door closing too loudly. Someone dropping something in the break room. My heart would race and I'd have to excuse myself, go stand in the bathroom until the adrenaline passed. I stopped going to the climbing gym. Stopped meeting friends for drinks. Made excuses when people invited me hiking. The thought of being in dense forest made my stomach tight. I had a winter camping trip planned for early November, 3 days in the Pasayten wilderness with 2 friends from work. I canceled a week before we were supposed to leave. Told them I was dealing with some personal stuff. They were understanding, but I could tell they were confused. I'd never canceled a trip before. At night, I'd lie in bed replaying the audio recordings through headphones, listening to those measured footfalls, that questioning huff, trying to understand what had happened, trying to reconcile it with everything I thought I knew about the world. My ex-wife called in early November. I'd been avoiding her messages, but finally she just called directly. "Hey," she said when I picked up. Her voice was careful, gentle. "I heard you had a rough trip. Mutual friends. Someone must have mentioned I seemed off." "I'm fine," I said. "Derek." She paused. "You don't have to tell me what happened, but I know that tone. You're isolating again." "I'm not isolating. I'm just busy." "Okay." She didn't push. She'd learned during our marriage that pushing me only made me retreat further. "Well, if you need to talk, or if you just need someone to listen, I'm here." We talked for maybe 5 more minutes. Surface stuff. How was work? How was her classroom? The weather turning cold. Then she said she had to go prep for the next day and we hung up. I felt guilty. She was trying to help and I was shutting her down. But how could I explain? How could I tell her that I'd spent a night being circled by something that shouldn't exist? That I had evidence, but no one official would acknowledge it? That every time I closed my eyes, I saw that track pressed deep in the mud? She'd think I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. I started avoiding forested areas completely. Took different routes to work that didn't go past the park. Stopped looking at my topo maps. Put my camping gear in the back of my closet where I wouldn't see it. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop replaying that night. The sense of being evaluated. Studied. The intelligence behind those deliberate actions. The knocks. The circling. The branch snapping. Whatever had been out there, it had made a choice about me. It had approached to within 15 yards, close enough to harm me easily, and then withdrawn. It had let me leave. That's what unsettled me most. Not the fear, the recognition. The sense that something had looked at me and understood what I was. Had cataloged me as another intelligent being, not a threat, not prey, just present. And I had no framework for processing that. No way to fit it into my understanding of the natural world. Friends started noticing. Asked if I was okay. I told them I was fine, just tired, work was busy. The usual deflections. But I wasn't fine. I was changed. The encounter had cracked something open in my understanding of reality, and I didn't know how to close it again. At night, I'd pull up Vernon's website and read through other reports. Hundreds of them. People describing experiences almost identical to mine. The silence, the knocks, the circling, the aftermath of doubt and isolation. I wasn't alone. That helped. Knowing other people had experienced this, had struggled with the same questions. But it didn't change the fundamental problem. I knew something existed that I couldn't prove to anyone who mattered. I had evidence that would be dismissed or explained away, and I was left carrying that knowledge by myself, unable to share it, unable to process it fully. The wilderness had always been my refuge, the place I went to find clarity and peace. Now it felt dangerous, unknown, full of things I didn't understand, and I didn't know if I'd ever feel safe out there again. Around Thanksgiving, I started looking for others online. Not researchers like Vernon, people who'd had encounters. Regular people who'd experienced something they couldn't explain and were trying to make sense of it. I found forums, small communities tucked away in corners of the internet where people shared their stories. Hunters who'd heard knocks while setting up tree stands. Loggers who'd found structures in remote timber sales. Backcountry guides who'd felt watched on trails they'd hiked 100 times. The stories were remarkably consistent. The silence that preceded everything, the sense of presence, the feeling of being evaluated rather than hunted. And afterward, the doubt, the isolation, the struggle to return to normal life. I created an account and posted my own story, kept it factual. The dates, the location, what I'd heard and seen. I mentioned the track, the structure, the audio recordings. Didn't embellish or speculate, just laid out the facts. The responses came quickly. People thanking me for sharing, saying they'd experienced similar things, offering solidarity. One message stood out, from someone who identified as retired Forest Service, 30 years in backcountry management. He sent me a private message. What you described matches suppressed protocols we were given, unofficial guidance passed down from senior rangers. If you encounter signs of their presence, knocks, structures, large bipedal tracks, document it but don't engage. Don't provoke, and don't expect official acknowledgement. I asked him what he meant by suppressed protocols. Off-the-record conversations, he wrote back. Senior staff who've been in the service 40, 50 years, they know these things exist. They've seen evidence. But the agency can't acknowledge it officially. Too much liability, too many questions about why they haven't done formal studies, so they handle it quietly. Log reports as bare activity, train rangers to deflect without lying, and tell backcountry staff to avoid confrontation, so they know. But knowing and acknowledging are different things. The official position will always be skepticism, but the unofficial position, the one passed between rangers over beers after shift, is that the Cascades have always had apex residents we don't fully understand. He told me there were clusters of activity, certain drainages that consistently generated reports, remote valleys where even experienced rangers felt uncomfortable camping alone, areas where game patterns didn't make sense unless you accounted for another large predator. The drainage west of Ross Lake was one of them, had been for decades. You weren't unlucky, he wrote. You were just the latest person to camp in known territory. I spent hours reading through the forum. Found patterns in the reports. Geographic clusters, seasonal variations, behavioral consistencies that suggested intelligence and communication. One retired logger described finding a structured shelter, not just broken trees, but a deliberate lean-to configuration, weathered and old, tucked in a ravine miles from any trail. He'd photographed it but never reported it officially because he knew what the response would be. A hunter described being followed for hours through deep snow, bipedal tracks paralleling his route, always staying just out of sight until he reached his truck. The tracks had approached within 30 yards of his camp, but never closer. Testing, observing. The stories varied, but the core elements remained constant. Intelligence, territory, communication between individuals, avoidance of direct confrontation with humans, and afterward the weight of knowing something the rest of the world refused to acknowledge. I found community in these forums. People who understood what I'd experienced, who didn't think I was crazy or mistaken, who carried the same burden of knowledge, but it didn't resolve anything. Didn't make the experience easier to process, just confirmed that I wasn't alone in this strange liminal space between knowing and being believed. Vernon emailed me in early December. Asked how I was holding up. I told him about the forums, the retired Forest Service guy, the patterns I'd been seeing in reports. "Good," he said. "You're processing it. That's important. A lot of people try to forget, try to convince themselves it didn't happen. But you can't unknow something. Better to understand it." He was right. I couldn't unknow it, couldn't unsee that track or unhear those footfalls. The question wasn't whether it had happened. The question was what I was going to do with that knowledge. In January, I finally pulled out my maps again. I spread them across my dining table, the topo, maps I'd carried on that October trip, marked with my planned route and actual path. I traced the drainage with my finger, the creek where I'd camped the first night, the bench above the willow marsh where I'd spent that long, terrifying second night. I marked the locations where I'd found evidence. The track at 48.7356 degrees north, 121.2891 degrees west. The structure at 48.7392 degrees north, 121.2847 degrees west. My second camp at roughly 48.7411 degrees north, 121.2803 degrees west. Then I pulled up satellite imagery on my laptop, studied the terrain from above. The drainage ran northwest to southeast, bounded by ridges on either side. Dense forest in the lower elevations, thinning to scattered stands higher up. Multiple side drainages feeding into the main valley. Good habitat for something large and reclusive. Water sources, cover, minimal human traffic. The nearest maintained trail was 4 miles west. The nearest road was 8 miles south. If you were a population of large primates trying to avoid human contact, this would be ideal territory. I started cross-referencing my experience with other reports from the area. Found 6 documented encounters within a 10-mile radius over the past 15 years. All described similar patterns, knocks, structures, the sense of being watched. None of the witnesses had seen the creatures clearly, just heard them, found their signs, felt their presence. Was I in a territory, near a travel route between different areas, or just unlucky enough to camp in the wrong place at the wrong time? I considered the alternative explanations one more time. Really tried to find something that fit better than the impossible conclusion. Pranksters? But who would be out there in mid-October, miles from any trail, just to mess with a solo camper they couldn't have known would be there? Misidentification? But the track was clear. The audio was unambiguous. The structure required massive strength. Sleep deprivation? Except I documented everything in real time. The photos weren't hallucinations. The recordings existed. Every rational explanation fell apart under scrutiny, which left the irrational explanation, except it wasn't irrational if the evidence supported it. I pulled up the track photo again, studied it for the 100th time. 16 inches, 5 toes, pronounced arch, depth suggesting 800 pounds or more. This was real. This had happened. The question that kept nagging at me: why had I been spared? Whatever circled my camp that night could have harmed me easily, could have driven me away earlier, could have made its presence known in more aggressive ways. Instead, it had observed, tested, communicated with others of its kind about my presence, and then withdrawn. That suggested restraint. Decision-making, perhaps even protocols of their own rules about when to interact with humans and when to avoid confrontation. Vernon had said they weren't a threat because I wasn't threatening them. But it felt like more than that. It felt like recognition, like something looking at me and understanding I was another intelligent being, temporary, not worth the risk of engagement. I thought about all the solo hikers who'd disappeared over the years in the Cascades. The SAR missions that never found bodies, the cold cases, were some of those encounters that went differently. Situations where the creatures felt threatened or cornered, or were they unrelated? Just tragic accidents in dangerous terrain? I didn't know. Probably would never know. What I did know was this: the wilderness held more than we acknowledged, more than official reports admitted, more than most people were willing to believe. And I'd been allowed a glimpse of it, had been evaluated and permitted to leave, had been given evidence that I could never fully prove but would carry with me forever. The maps lay spread across my table, the drainage marked with my careful annotations, the evidence stored on my laptop and backed up in multiple locations. Real, documented, undeniable, and completely utterly unresolved. It's been over a year now since that October trip. I still think about it every day. I do camp again. Started going out with friends in the spring, short trips to popular areas where the trails are well maintained and you see other hikers. I bought bear spray, keep it clipped to my pack strap even though I never needed it before. I carry a satellite beacon now too. The thing I used to call a crutch, but I don't go solo anymore. Can't bring myself to do it. The thought of being alone in deep wilderness, miles from the nearest person, makes my chest tight. Not because I'm afraid of being attacked. That's not it. I'm unsettled by what I learned. By the intelligence I sensed that night, the control and patience it demonstrated. Whatever circled my camp had every advantage: size, strength, knowledge of terrain, cover of darkness. It could have driven me away earlier, could have made me leave. That drainage, before I even set up my second camp, instead it observed, communicated with others of its kind, approached to within 15 yards and then withdrew. I was evaluated, cataloged, and then allowed to leave. That's what haunts me. Not the fear, the recognition. The sense that something looked at me and understood what I was, made a calculated decision about whether I was worth engaging with, decided I wasn't a threat, wasn't interesting enough, wasn't worth the risk. I was permitted to survive. That's different from surviving by chance or skill. I still have the evidence. The photos are backed up in 3 locations. The audio recordings are stored safely. I look at them sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep. The 16-inch track, the structure, the measured footfalls captured on my phone. Vernon still emails occasionally. Asks if I've thought about going back with cameras. I tell him no, maybe someday. Probably not. The truth is, I don't need more evidence. I know what I experienced. I know what lives in that drainage west of Ross Lake. And I know that the official world will never acknowledge it, not because the evidence isn't there, but because acknowledging it would raise too many uncomfortable questions about what else we've missed, about what else is watching us when we venture into their territory, about whether we're really at the top of the food chain in the deep wilderness or just tolerated visitors. I think about the people who'll go there next. Solo hikers looking for solitude, hunters pushing into remote valleys, backcountry skiers in winter. They'll file for permits. They'll pack their gear. They'll feel confident and capable. And if the forest goes silent, if they hear knocks in the darkness, most of them will rationalize it, will convince themselves it's nothing. We'll push deeper into territory that isn't really ours. I want to warn them, want to tell them to trust their instincts, to leave when the silence gets too heavy, to understand that being allowed to pass through isn't the same as being welcome. But I know they won't listen. I wouldn't have listened either back in October when I was confident and dismissive and sure I understood how the world worked. The wilderness holds more than we acknowledge. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, not because we lack evidence, but because the truth would force us to reconsider our place in the wild. And maybe that's how it should be. If the forest goes silent, trust your instincts and leave. That's all I can tell you.